Allison here from Learning at the Primary Pond. I am so excited to have Kelly Hoover with me today. Kelly is from the Ascend Learning Group, which is in Denver, Colorado. Kelly, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so excited you're here. We've actually done another interview with Becky from Ascend previously, which was awesome, and I know a lot of you loved, so I'm excited to have Ascend Learning back. Kelly, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and why you do it?
So I am a learning therapist with Ascend Learning using smarter intervention. And like you said, we're based out of Denver, Colorado. I think the easiest way to say what we do, we work with fragile and impacted readers and the people who support them. So we provide reading therapy in a one-on-one setting with students. We provide professional development and training for teachers. And we have a curriculum that we use for our students that specifically targets some of the hallmarks of struggling readers.
Awesome. I love what Ascend does. I wish that I lived in Colorado just so I could get in the action, but I think that's awesome.
Oh, thank you.
So today the topic of our conversation is going to be what we as teachers do, whether we're in the general education classroom or providing reading support or something different. How do we prevent those gaps that kids tend to get in their phonics knowledge? So how do we prevent them, but also how do we deal with the gaps once they're already there, right? Like not all of us are kindergarten teachers. We don't all start at the beginning, pre-K teachers. Some of us are getting readers, like myself included, that have those gaps already. So how do we prevent them, but also how do we deal with the gaps once they're already there?
Okay. Absolutely.
Cool. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Kelly, was I've talked before on my blog a lot about using a systematic approach to teaching phonics. And so systematic versus incidental. Why? Maybe you can talk more about what those words mean and also why we want to use a systematic approach versus the incidental.
Absolutely. So I love this question and I'm glad you're passionate about it too, because it's something we feel so strongly about. And in all of the realms of our work, you will hear us always refer to, or like in our blog post, we always refer to the Jenga tower, because to us, a child's phonetic code is like the Jenga tower, that when they're little and they begin developing that sound symbol relationship, we begin building the blocks, right? But by the time a student gets into first grade, second grade, if you look at their tower, there may be holes. We believe there are more holes, and research tells us there are more holes if we haven't had systematic instruction. If we haven't had systematic phonics instruction, then eventually you're going to get to about second grade and that tower is going to be wobbly because of all the holes.
And I love that analogy. Sorry to interrupt you, but I love that. Yeah, I love that.
It has really changed the way we think about our instruction and how we teach, because then we also know you can keep building, you can keep layering those blocks, but eventually it's going to topple. And it's all going to go back to those holes that were at the foundation. So we feel passionately about systematic instruction because the other side of that coin is incidental phonics. And we define incidental phonics as teaching a phonetic rule when it pops up. So, for example, if your instruction does not include any phonetic instruction, or you're just using text-based instruction and teaching it up let's say you have a text that really focuses or has a lot of words with the magic E rule. You're going to take time and teach that to your students. Well, that's great, but what have they had prior to that to access that learning and to build on? And then what will they have after that? If you're just teaching it incidentally as it comes up, you're kind of jumping around. And so then think of that in terms of the Jenga tower, right? You're just kind of sticking blocks in places where they don't go, and there's not a foundation to build that on. And something I've seen happen in a lot of schools when phonics instruction is being taught in an incidental manner, that typically means there isn't a roadmap for the teachers to follow, or there isn't a common scope and sequence. And so something I've seen happen a lot when that occurs is the teachers are having to start over every single year because they can't be guaranteed what was taught the year before, especially if it was incidental and just done as it popped up. And so then what can happen is the kindergarten teacher may call it the magic E. First grade teacher may call it the silent E. Second grade teacher may call it the magnetic E. Now, some kids are savvy enough, they're going to get it and realize, oh, we're talking about the same thing. This is the same rule. Our fragile learners, they're going to think that's a different rule all the time. And it just begins to compound their confusion and frustration, especially our dyslexic readers where phonemes are fuzzy to begin with. So I feel like there's a lot of dangers with incidental phonics. I'm a fan of systematic phonics instruction because, again, that Jenga tower, I'm going to start with the easiest concepts, the most concrete concepts. I'm not starting with vowel teams that can make 2 or 3 sounds. I'm starting with concrete sounds, letters that make 1 sound, our consonants, our short vowels, and I'm going to build that foundation. And when we're solid there with these easy, 1-syllable words with these short vowel sounds, then I'm going to begin building. Then I'm going to begin the magic E, and we're going to learn long vowel sounds and bossy R, and I'm going to begin layering, making sure there aren't holes, but making sure my students are ready for some of that instruction, like the bossy R. You have to know your vowel sounds before you get to the bossy R, because that R changes everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I just jump into the deep end of teaching a bossy R, that syllable type to my students when they haven't had short vowels prior to that or long vowels, imagine that confusion.
Yeah.
I have to prepare them. I have to have them ready to access that information. So to me, that's why it goes back to systematic instruction, starting with simple concepts and then slowly building as they're ready and as I see proficiency into these more complex concepts. It's that Jenga tower. It all goes back to that Jenga tower for us.
Yeah, and I like what you said about the proficiency thing too, because what I've seen a lot with my students who tend to be, they have issues with their reading. Sometimes like they have been taught the short vowels, but it's not solidified. Like they still don't quite have that down, which can take a while for some kids. And then like you said, when you throw in bossy R, but they don't have the short vowels, even if they've had it before, they don't have that mastery, and you're just confusing them and making it harder on them and yourself too.
So true. I think there's such a difference between exposure and mastery, and the work that needs to go in there, that continued exposure, that review, that practice, and encoding with this new phonogram, and then looking for that proficiency before we move on. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges of being a teacher, though, is you have that pressure of the standards and report card time is coming up, and I have to get them to this point before the end of the year. And so you have that pressure to scoot them through, even if you're not seeing that proficiency. But see, again, to me, that goes back to systematic instruction, because if I'm aligned, vertically with my K team, my 1 team, my 2 team, then I know if I only got through half of vowel teams by the end of the year and my babes are going on to the next teacher, if she has the right resources, she can assess that, see where I left off, know where to pick up without having to recreate the wheel or using different language, and give that instruction. If we're piggybacking on each other and going in a systematic format, then that's okay. We can really teach to mastery rather than just exposure and pushing them through.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, it's a classroom problem in that we have to meet the needs of our individual kids, but it's also a school problem where I don't know how that systematic system, not to use system twice, but systematic system could really be established unless a school is on the same page, so that that your kids had short vowels or whatever, or even if they had them and maybe they didn't master them, what else they've worked on, you can go back there. And so I feel like in many cases we as the teachers need to be the advocates for that, because I know so many schools don't have a scope and sequence at all. And so that's really difficult. That's not our fault, but in some cases, I think we really need to advocate for everybody getting on the same page for our kiddos.
I think that is the number one fastest and easiest way to begin eliminating some reading difficulties is for teams. I mean, obviously it's so important horizontally to be aligned, the entire first grade team, for example, but I think that vertical alignment of K1 and 2 and having this scope and sequence, and honestly, each year benefits from that. And then even third through fifth is going to benefit, because they can look at where the kids are coming from and begin to layer in morphology or more advanced concepts, because they can trust that foundation. They know that's there. They can literally look back to the scope and sequence. Oh, the students have had this. Now this is where I get to pick up. Really, I think that's one of the most important things to having a strong literacy program, is that vertical alignment with a scope and sequence, just a roadmap.
Right. And really, it takes a little time to set up, but it doesn't have to be that difficult to get everybody on the same page. I know that you guys have a scope and sequence available. We're going to put it in this blog post or link it for you, but can you talk a little bit more about that and the order that you use too? Because I know so many teachers will benefit from having access to that.
I'm so glad. We are so happy to share this. And yes, we will give you the link so your audience can go straight to there and access it. And one more thing I wanted to piggyback on before I tell you kind of the method to our madness with creating this is you said sometimes it does take more time. And you're right, like up front, if the team wants to create their own scope and sequence, that is going to be front loading that time. But I found when I was in settings that didn't have a scope and sequence and I created my own or borrowed my own from someplace, it actually took more time if I didn't have that scope and sequence, because then if I know, like if I'm incidentally teaching phonics, right? And I realize, oh, this is a good way to teach Magic E to my kids. Well, then I have to go and scrounge for Magic E resources, other texts that are presenting Magic E, center activities, those kinds of things. But if I have my scope and sequence ahead of time, that makes my long-term planning so much easier. I know which decodable texts I want to pull in. I know what center activities I want to pull in. I know what, multisensory resources I want to grab because I know what's coming up.
That's so true. So spending the time up front saves you so much time later on. And also then you're not just to me, like I get overwhelmed mentally with thinking about everything. And when you're teaching it incidentally, just here and there, like I'm not going to remember, did I teach this? Did I teach that? It adds to your mental load versus when you have that roadmap, it's so clear on where you're starting and where you need to go.
Exactly. And then you can go deeper and really give that explicit instruction. There's some programs that have kids, it's not necessarily incidental because it does go in a sequence, but it has kids placed in different groups. So you might have students working on an open syllable concept and some kids in your Magic E concept, and you're going around to the groups, which in theory sounds great because it's differentiated. However, kids aren't getting that explicit instruction that they need to then keep building. So having the scope and sequence, again, it allows you that opportunity to explicitly go deep with a concept. And even if kids have had that concept before, then you put them into a differentiated list. So I know that my students last year had closed syllables. They worked on CK. They know that when it follows a short vowel, you spell it CK. When it follows anything else, you spell it with a K. I have some kids who didn't master that last year. So I'm going to have them in a word list with one syllable words, simple consonants, pack, tick, dock. But then I have other kids showing some proficiency with it. So I'm going to bring in some blends and I'm going to give them words, like crack and chick. And then I have my kids who mastered it last year. So this year I'm bringing in morphology with them with locking. And, I might even throw in the word milk to them, one of those words that ends with a K, and see if they can really differentiate that rule. But I can do that and plan for that if I have my scope and sequence and I know what's coming up.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So you have like continuity, but differentiation at the same time.
Exactly. So sorry, I didn't mean to go down a bunny trail.
No, not at all.
I get so excited talking about this that I can tend to go off topic. So getting back, you had a great question. How did we develop, what was the method to our madness when we developed our scope and sequence? So we have two programs. One is our foundations program, which is for our littles. And then the other scope and sequence that I'm going to give you guys is for our decoding and encoding. So those are students who have their consonant and vowel sounds, blends and digraphs intact. So for the littles, our scope and sequence was developed. It was based primarily on the Orton-Gillingham scope and sequence. And the method to the madness and the way that was done is it's giving students, it's right away empowering them with a consonant and a vowel sound, short vowel sounds at the beginning, that they can pair together immediately to begin forming simple syllables and words to decode. So that we don't want to go through the process of we're going to introduce you to all the letters and sounds, and then we're going to start putting them together to decode. We want to be doing that simultaneously. So that was the method to the madness with the scope and sequence for the littles. And then the decoding and encoding scope and sequence, again, it's systematic that it starts really simple and it gets more complex. It's literally building that tower. So we start with our simple closed syllable, short vowels is our first syllable type. And then we progress through the rest of the 6 syllable types. So incrementally we're introducing, so we go to Magic E, then we have our bossy R, then we get into open syllables, vowel teams, and finally stable final syllables. So you can see how it goes really easy. Short vowel sounds, closed syllables, to down the road, 5th syllable type is when we get to our vowel teams where things get crazy and 3 different sounds and all that stuff. We never start there.
Yeah,
We
so it's very systematic.
mm-hmm.
Build in the
Yep.
giant tower. That's awesome. Well, I'm so excited to share this with everyone. Yeah, super excited. We'll definitely link that in the comments, so look for that. And I know that, so you were mentioning some terms like closed syllables, and I've seen on your blog that you have different blog posts about the syllable types. So, right, am I right about that? Yeah.
You are absolutely right. Yes, all of our instruction is done through the teaching of the 6 syllable types. And the reason we do that is, you know, a lot of our kids know how to count a syllable, how to clap a syllable, but don't really understand what it means.
Right.
So we can teach our phonics instruction through the syllable types. The syllable type is always going to predict that vowel sound. And that is what we have found for our fragile readers to be the trickiest part. So if we can help them predict that when they're decoding and encoding or spelling, they have so much more success because there's a concrete rule to it.
Yeah.
We don't just have to say, oh, this is a silly letter, and sometimes it makes this sound or that sound. We can tell them this is a silly letter, but when you see it this way, it's going to make this sound. And when you see it this way, it's going to make that sound. Teaching it through the syllable types makes that concrete.
Yeah, it's more of a science rather than just guessing.
Exactly. It's explicit. They don't have to guess.
Yeah. So if you're watching this and you don't know about the syllable types, definitely go over to Ascend Learning's blog. I will link that too, and read more about that, because that's not something that I know that I learned it. I did not learn it in my undergrad. I did not learn it in my master's program, which is in reading. I learned it through my own research and also getting certified in Horton Gillingham. So definitely go check that out on their blog if that's something that you need to learn more about.
And don't you agree, like, it changed the way you taught? Like, to me, that just ended up, oh, this is how we teach reading. This is how it's need to be taught. Yes.
Yeah. And I don't know why it's not. I mean, you know, I can't speak for all undergrad or graduate programs. I don't know why it's included. I got lucky in a sense that, so when I first started teaching, I was teaching in English, and I was kind of piecing things together, but I did not have the understandings that I do now just about the English language. I actually have another degree in Spanish, and I took linguistics in Spanish. So I had a better understanding in some ways of the Spanish language, having taken linguistics.
Yes.
When I became a bilingual teacher, it was actually pretty easy for me to teach kids to read in Spanish because I had that background. So when I came back to teaching in English, I realized, like, that's what I needed. I was missing that piece. That's so important.
Exactly. I agree. I love hearing that, because I feel so strongly about it that this transforms the way we teach reading and the way our kids learn how to read. And it's so funny. We work with so many adults who say, well, oh my gosh, like, that's the rule. That's why that letter makes that sound. Or, you know, so many of our kids spend so many years being taught that Y is sometimes a vowel, but they're never told when, or they're never told what vowel sounds it makes. That's not something explicitly taught. Just a small example that, oh my gosh, this would, I think, just revolutionize the way our kids are reading.
Right. Because English is a crazy language, but it's something like 80 to 85% of words or whatever do follow those patterns. So, like, yes, there are some weird words out there, but I don't think we can, like, throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, oh, it's crazy. Like, there's a method to the madness.
Exactly. And knowing, especially like our dyslexic readers, their brain needs that concrete information. If we just leave it up to guessing for them, or, you know, I kind of feel like reading for the longest time has been taught with this implicit philosophy that if we expose the child to enough literature and immerse them in a print-rich environment, they're just naturally and magically going to learn how to read. And research tells us 25% of every classroom, that's true, 25% of those kids are going to learn to read no matter what we expose them to or what curriculum we use. Or if the other 75%, they have to have that explicit, structured literacy, phonetic instruction in order to learn how to read. So it's not just this implicit magical thing. We have to make it concrete. Otherwise, those students look more impacted than they are, or they look an impacted reader when they're not. They just needed explicit instruction.
Yeah. So we have to teach to all our kids, not just a small percentage.
Well, and that's the cool thing is with systematic structured instruction like this, every kid benefits. It's not just a handful that benefit from this. Every single reader benefits from this type of instruction. It helps our fragile readers grow. It helps our strongest readers continue to excel. So it's, again, to me, like, this is what needs to be taught universally because this benefits everybody.
Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So one other question I had, so we know that how important it is to lay that foundation and make sure that it's systematic and explicit. Something that I deal with, and I know that a lot of other teachers deal with too, is I will get readers who maybe they're in third grade and I can't control what's happened in the past like 3 years of their instruction, right? But I want to help them. So for those of us teachers who have students that we're already working with, you know, even as early as first grade, and there's already gaps. How do we tell if there's gaps? And I guess I'll say my other question, but how do we deal with that? So first, how do we tell if there are gaps? What do we do to figure that out?
Oh, that's such a good question. And so to me, again, this is going to go back to that Jenga tower and having a scope and sequence. So you can see what have they been exposed to, but also, if you're not using a scope and sequence, then it is harder to find out where those goals are, or I'm sorry, where those gaps and holes are. I combined those two words. It's harder to determine where those are, but then it's harder to know when you're going to go back and fill them in or repair them.
Yeah.
So using a scope and sequence would still be my number one answer to that. But then secondly, having an assessment, especially when you first get your students, a type of baseline assessment that's going to determine that how intact is their phonetic code. I think that's going to help you give a profile of your readers and possibly ability group them into students who have more gaps or holes than others. So something else we're going to link for you, for your audience, is it's a pre-post test, but it's a baseline to gather that information, and it probes. It's not a lengthy assessment. It's one that can easily be used in the classroom. But it probes deep enough you can tell, do they have this skill intact or not? And then you can use it as a post-test measure to see, after your exposure and instruction and review, have they mastered that? And I think this baseline is important so you know where your kids are starting from, but also you're going to want to be continue to monitoring that as you move along, right? So after you've introduced a specific phonogram, are you seeing them generalize that to then text that they're reading? Are you seeing them apply that learning out of the context of your reading table? Are they able to use this in their spelling work and in their writing work as well, or in other books that are aside from the curriculum in which you've introduced this? So that constant review is going to be important. But I also think it's funny, this circles back to, if you're aligned vertically, then, and using the same scope and sequence, then you're going to be hitting all those different Jenga blocks, right? And so I think I said this earlier, that if I know week 1 in my scope and sequence is to introduce closed syllables with the CK ending, and I look at my pre-test, or my, this assessment I've given you, the pre-test information, and I have some kids who don't have that concept at all. I know they were given it last year, but they didn't master it. I have some it's kind of intact, and then some that have got it and they're running with it. I can plan for that. I can plan how to fill in those holes, like I said, by using simple word lists. That goes back to the lock and the pack and the tick and the talk, simple 1-syllable words. My kids who have some proficiency with it, then I'm going to extend that and make sure I get them to mastery. And I'm going to start bringing in some words that are a little more challenging, knowing they were exposed to this last year, with some friends, like crack and chick, and make this work a little harder, and start bringing in some decodable texts that reflect this rule. And then my kids who mastered it, and I know that I don't need to go back and reteach it from the beginning with them, but I still need to be strengthening it. I'm going to be doing maybe a little more encoding work with them, using it in their writing. I'm going to be bringing in morphology to those CK words and giving them words like locking. I think I said earlier, bringing in the word like milk and think. Can they really distinguish when I use a CK and when I use a K? And then bringing in also fluency passages for them and decodable texts where they can apply that learning. So same rule, everyone is still on low syllable CK phonogram, but look how I've differentiated it to make sure the kids who needed mastery, I'm going to bring them the mastery. My kids who've mastered it, I'm going to take them to the next step. And using that assessment is what's going to help me determine that. Who needs that? Because if I don't have that assessment, then I'm just teaching it. Think how many deaf ears that's going to fall on, right? How many kids are going to be like, oh my gosh, I already have this. Or how many kids just might be lost because I'm not starting at the point they need it. So I would say vertical alignment, scope and sequence, and then using this assessment or any assessment tool that's going to give you a grasp of their phonetic code and their phonetic knowledge and where those holes are so that you can teach it, but then keep going back and making sure that that hole has been filled in and that they're applying it and generalizing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that approach because there's like, did I say this? I probably said this before, but there's continuity, but still differentiating, because I feel like in so many cases, it's either a school, well, different cases, they don't have any scope or sequence available to teachers, which is really hard.
Yes.
Or they have one and everybody's marching through the scope and sequence at, exactly the same pace, but there's no like differentiation, but we all know kids develop at different rates with their spelling and phonics knowledge.
Yes.
So I feel like that approach really is the best of both worlds, where it's laid out, but there's still room for differentiation. So
absolutely. And
awesome.
That scope and sequence, we don't want it to be like, lockstep like that. It is a roadmap, but exactly, you need to differentiate for those students and find a way. We always say with intervention, there's two main goals: to fill the holes and gaps, but then also to help that student then apply that learning, that application.
Yeah.
Everything, right? Generalizing from skills in isolation to applying it to classroom related tasks. So those are going to be introduced differently to the students depending where they are. Like I said, some students, you do need them in that word list. You do need to be doing those multisensory activities with them just to cement CK and the sound that makes. And you're going to have these other kids that are ready to go into writing with CK or ready to go into a decodable text and apply it that way. They're going to apply it differently. But as a teacher, it saved my sanity a little bit to just know I'm just doing closed syllables and CK this week. I don't have 10 different phonograms and 10 different groups and 10 different, phonics-based centers I'm trying to create.
Right, because that is a challenge if it's 100% differentiated. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then you can't get to that explicit teaching, I don't think.
Right.
When I was in the classroom, I couldn't. That was just too hard for me. I was running around to all my different groups of, you're doing Magic E and you're doing this, and I wasn't explicitly teaching. And I sent that group on with more holes. I wish I knew then what I know now.
Yeah. Hindsight 2020, right?
Yes.
So let's say that we're talking about gaps. Let's say that you do the assessment and you see, okay, like these kids have these gaps. Can you maybe like give us a step or two? Like, what do we do next once we are aware of what those gaps are pretty clearly?
So once you do know where those gaps are, I think it's so important to then create work where you can explicitly teach that letter and sound relationship. We always start with that sound symbol relationship, what it looks like, what it sounds like, and then we would bring that into what syllable type is this so that we know what the vowel sound is going to be, and begin exposing students to words that are going to represent that phonogram and work on tapping that out and decoding that. And if it's a student that needs to stay in one syllable words, great. If it's a student that you can maybe start to bridge to multi-syllable words, that's excellent. Working with those words in isolation just at the word level. And as we begin to gain proficiency, then we're going to go into encoding, and we're going to move up and having those words embedded in sentences and getting to the sentence level. So we start at the sound level, get to the word level, phrase level, sentence level, representing that phonogram or those sounds in what are now hopefully familiar words. Would be the process that I would recommend.
So you just go whatever's easier in the scope and sequence, and you kind of start there and work your way down, but also like bringing in other concepts so the kids can see, right, how, like, for example, blends work with digraphs or, stuff like that.
And that's one reason too that I really am a big advocate for using a scope and sequence so that you don't miss those things. So like you said this earlier, so check that box. I know I have introduced blends and digraphs and my kids have those. Now I'm heading into closed syllables. And so that you're going to know, for example, when to bring in your welded sounds, that so you know when that is, and you know that you've taught that to your students, and then can begin holding them accountable for it. And if you're using the same structured literacy format or routine for this instruction, daily, then it's pretty easy. Your kids are going to get in that routine. They're going to get used to it. It's just a different sound each week or a different phonetic rule each week, but you can practice it in the same ways, going from the sound level with it to the word, to the phrase, to the sentence level, and giving them that opportunity to apply it then in connected text, the sentence level.
Which is our goal, right? Like that's what, you know, some people worry about like, oh, well, I don't want to do too much like isolated like drill with phonics, but that's not our purpose here, right? Like we're, you know, we may be isolating a sound to talk about it specifically, but it's always for that goal of real reading and writing too.
Exactly. And there does have to be, no, we would never want to teach skills in isolation ever, but when you're first learning, seeing the word and the phonogram and the sound in the word, you do need to have some word lists to look at those decodable words and then get ready to put it into connected text. Whereas the opposite of that, if I'm not giving phonetic strategies and I'm giving a student a book and teaching them, look at the picture clues, look at the shape of the letters, I'm teaching them to guess at the word, not to decode the word. And that's scary to me because I know 1 in 5 kids aren't going to be able to do that. So I want to give them the phonetic rule, that foundation at the sound and word level, then get them into the sentence level, passage level, text level of connected text. So we're applying it, but I can't just take them into the deep end first.
No, definitely not. They have to work in conjunction, work together.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Well, Kelly, is there anything else that you want to add?
Oh my gosh, I think I've talked so much.
No, it's so helpful. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, it has been. It's been so nice to talk to you. No, thank you for this opportunity. It's so great to meet you and get to talk to you. And we're excited to share our resources. Again, we feel so strongly about a scope and sequence that we're so happy to be able to share it with your readers, and I hope they like it.
Yes, well, I appreciate that so much. I know there's going to be a lot of happy teachers too. We will link to, let's see, the scope and sequence. We will link to that assessment too on your site. And then if people want to learn more about you and Ascend Learning and what you do, where can they go to do that?
So we have 2 different websites. You can look at ascendlearning.com, and that's just a bit more about our private therapy business. Our reading therapy, lots of great information there. Then our curriculum resources are going to be at smarterintervention.com, and that's where we have all the blogs that you referred to that I would hope teachers would enjoy. We've written to teachers, we love teachers, and our curriculum resources as well.
Awesome. So ascendlearning.com, .org or .com?
.com,
and then smarterintervention.com.
smarterintervention.com.
Perfect. We will link to both of those in the post. Kelly, thank you so much for being here. This was awesome. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. It was so great to meet you. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.